was a moment where Angela Rayner was sitting down in the Prime Minister's seat next to the dispatch box doing little heart symbols across the dispatch box.
Only Ange get away with it.
Exactly.
Well, complete change this week. Lizzie Buchan is away. She's been on a plane for 27 hours with the Prime Minister. She's now in Samoa. So instead, we have her deputy, Mikey Smith.
Hello.
And I'm delighted to say we have a special guest this week, Matthew Laza, who I have known a long time. He used to work for Ed Miliband when he was leader. Now a speechwriter and political commentator. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely to be here.
Pleasure.
My name is Sam Lister. I'm the political editor at the Daily Express. We are also joined by Mikey Smith, Deputy Political Editor at the Daily Mirror, and this is The Division Bell.
We have some poll results on our poll. Do you agree with Labour's plans to release prisoners early to ease overcrowding? And I can tell you that overall, between Express and Mirror readers, it was 56% said yes, 44% said no. As you might expect, Express readers less fond of this plan. 14% said yes, 86% said no, and Mirror readers 65% yes and 35% no. So what do we think of that result, Sam?
Well, I don't think it's surprising, is it? I'm actually surprised so many Daily Mirror readers are actually in favour of this, but I'm not surprised by our readers. Obviously, they're really angry about this. They think... the way we saw released this week, these were hardened criminals. These were people who have sentences of 5 years or more. These are not, your low-level offenders. We saw the image, we put it on our front page this week, of one prisoner who'd been in for 7 years. He was supposed to be in for 7 years for kidnap and GBH. He came out and he stuck up his thumbs and said, "Big up Keir Starmer." And I think that really encapsulates the problem we've got with this, that it does not look great to people out there who are thinking, are we safe on the streets with these people coming out?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, clearly it's a very difficult moment for the government in terms of public perception. I'm actually amazed that the poll wasn't, as Sam says, that it wasn't more hostile to it. And so it's good to see that Mirror readers understand that the difficult decisions have to be made really... I mean, difficult decisions is a kind of politician's phrase, isn't it? They're not difficult, they're unpalatable, not just to the public, but to the politicians doing it. I mean, we saw the Prime Minister said he was really angry when that guy, gave him the thumbs up, as it were. And that's understandable because, these are people who've committed, as you say, Sam, really serious crimes and they're being let out early. The problem is it's a really serious mess and it needs sorting out. And this is the way that it has to be done. And I think that what actually, weirdly, Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, when she was doing her interviews this week, I thought it was a very impressive performance. She was very clear that when people have come back, not because they've recommitted a crime, but because they have breached their licence conditions, which is the conditions of reporting, etc., that they have. She actually said, well, that's a success because it shows the system is working, and it does. So, the fact that some people have been recycled in the system actually shows in a way that the system is working, that if people are breaking the rules upon which they've been released, they're coming back. So, good on Mirror readers, understand the anger of everybody, including Express readers, it's something the government hates doing as much as many members of the public hate seeing it. But clearly it has to be done. This is all part of the government having to take the pain early. Hopefully, we're getting things sorted in the medium and long term.
I think that one of the problems is though it's that contrast, isn't it, between the summer riots and Keir Starmer being absolutely resolute about his desire to be tough on people who were inciting violence, and understandably, these are actually serious things. If you are encouraging people to violence, that is a serious thing. But I think actually from the public's point of view, they see people who have been idiotic on Twitter being jailed, and then they see people who have been done for kidnap coming out and being picked up by their mates. being released early. And I think that contrast is not great for him. I also think that there is a bit of an issue because obviously in the first wave of these prisoner releases, there were 37 were released that shouldn't have been released, who'd been in there for domestic violence and sexual offences. And obviously they were then recalled back to prison. So in some ways, you're right, that the system works. But it's not very reassuring to the public. So I think there are some issues there. But, clearly there is a big problem with the prison system.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, in terms of those mistakes that happened at the beginning, they were wrong. I'm glad they got away. It's amazing that a bit of the Home Office actually worked. As we know that John Reid, the Labour Minister, said 20 years ago that it wasn't fit for purpose, and I'm quite sure why it's, in a sense, it's still in existence. I personally think the Home Office should be broken up, particularly its immigration functions separated, so we have a very clear focus on immigration. But that's a story for another day. In terms of how people see the two-tier justice, the two-tier Keir tag that we have. I mean, I think we have to remember that he doesn't control sentencing. He's not sitting in Downing Street pressing a button and saying you will have longer, you will go to prison for shorter. It's just this awful clash of the moments. I think that I think it was quite right in the days immediately while the riots were happening that judges went into overdrive. With their sentencing, but I think that perhaps they need to just be realistic now about what the prison's population can take. Now, in a sense, that deterrent factor, obviously, all sentences are deterrents, but that immediate factor, whilst people were still thinking about going out on the streets, that's part of that judge's discretion. So, although what the most famous case of the councillor's wife said has hit the headlines, what she said was obviously absolutely disgraceful, and I actually think she should have gone to prison. Whether the sentence is too long or not, I think is a moot point. Probably, of course, though, should be released early. So I think we probably, if in her favour, she will have that. So because she won't be treated. I mean, those people who went in, of course, won't be treated for stuff around the riots. Won't be treated any differently to anybody else. So I think the government needs to be careful on its rhetoric. But this review of sentencing, I think, is a really astute political move. So Shabana Mahmood, the Labour Justice Secretary, has asked her Tory predecessor David Gauke, who fell out with the Tory party, but still broadly remains a Tory, to look at sentencing, because we need a proper national debate about it, starting from the viewpoint that we all want less crime, and that means less reoffending. And so, yes, of course, we're going to have to. We must lock up people who should be locked up. But we need to work out for lower offences whether community sentencing, whether tagging, etc., for longer works better in terms of what we all want, which is less crime, fewer victims, and a safer streets.
A couple of things that I think have got slightly lost in this when we're getting a sense of perspective about it. Firstly, the guy who was released after 7 years, he wasn't going to serve another 7 years. He was going to be out in a month or so anyway.
Absolutely.
The early release is not that early. It's easing the strain on the system by a little bit because you're releasing people slightly early. In all likelihood, the guy with the G-Wagon would probably have been celebrating when he got out, whatever happened.
Yeah.
I imagine, big up Keir Starmer was a little bit of fun on his part, but people are happy when they get out of prison. That's not unusual. The other thing, and it's a thing Shabana Mahmood said yesterday, was she rightly pointed out this was a problem they got landed with that they can't build their way out of. It takes a long time to build a prison.
And nobody wants one.
And nobody wants one right next to them. That came up in Keir Starmer's conference speech. It's like, you're going to have, if we're going to make everything right, some of you are going to have prisons next door. And that's going to have to be fine. But this is, we're banging an old drum, but this is a problem that was caused by a decade of not building prisons. Repeatedly promising to build prisons, but not actually building any.
I mean, what I think as well is what really undermines public confidence is this very British sort of way of doing things, which is somebody gets 10 years, but we all know that the starting point is not 10 years, it's 5 years.
Yeah.
And that's developed over time. That's not particularly one government or another. But that just because people start by saying, well, they're going to get 10 years, but they're only going to do 5. Well, if somebody at the beginning is going to do 5, and then if they're being released early for good behaviour, or if there's something like this happens, then it just seems less like it's the percentage of the sentence served. Yeah. And it's just a total British joke, isn't it?
Yeah.
That you're literally, the sentence is just not true because it's half what the judge says.
Maybe we just need to
Absolutely.
review the entire sentencing system. Well, Matthew, the Labour Party, the Labour government has had a bit of a difficult time since they came into power because of the winter fuel allowance cuts that they announced very early on, and they've been a bit on the back foot ever since. So this budget is a really big deal for them. How are they? You're a Labour insider. Tell us how they're going to sell this to the public after 100 and odd days of negative publicity.
Well, look, I mean, I can tell you that inside the party, obviously, there's been disquiet, both from those MPs for whom it was a very rude awakening. It was slipped out of the winter fuel allowance, and it's just grown. It's absolutely what you don't want in terms of political communication, which is a story that just kept getting bigger. So there's disquiet amongst the MPs who basically thought they were going to have a nice summer, but instead faced it with a lot of letters about the winter. And the winter fuel allowance, and thought they were going to be heroes when they went to the supermarket, and instead were having distraught not just older people, but people worried about their parents coming up to them as well. So you've got that concern, but you've also got the insider concern. I mean, firstly, I think it's pretty clear now that it was a mistake not to have a budget earlier on. Now I sat down with somebody from the Treasury after saying, "Oh my goodness, we haven't got enough." Who went into the Treasury? We haven't got enough time to get the budget sorted because Rishi, and it all comes back to Rishi, had this election in July. You can't do a budget in August apparently because everybody's on holiday and you can't cancel civil servants' holiday plans. Maybe they should have done that. Absolutely. And then because September the party conferences, where Parliament comes back for a couple of weeks and then everybody goes, we should say to the seaside. So my age when they say we go the conferences used to be the seaside. Now go off to the party conferences in our large cities, and therefore it sort of slipped. And it's not just at the beginning of October; it's right at the end. So I think the number one political lesson that anybody in politics has taken is do not allow a vacuum to come around during a budget. In terms of the messaging on this budget, I think it's what they're worried about is getting the balance right between getting the pain in early, which is we were talking about with prisoner release, about making clear that really tough decisions have to be made, that there isn't any, to use the famous phrase, there isn't any money left. But you also have to have enough sense of direction and a sense of hope that doesn't overwhelm. So that's what they're thinking about in terms of the messaging. I think they think that times, people think that maybe early on when they first revealed the black hole, that maybe the messaging was too gloomy. We saw at party conference that they tried to ramp up the positivity, and I think that they've got to get that balance right. I mean, I think that the hope is, that maybe they'll be proven right from Labour advisors, is that people forget what happens in the first budget and they remember what happens in the last budget, and they're hoping the last budget will be all good news, or as much good news as a Chancellor can have. So that's the kind of strategic thinking that's going on inside the party.
Well, there's been some. I'm slightly concerned we're going to have nothing left to write because everything seems to have been pre-announced. But I'm sure there'll be some rabbits out the hat and a few things slipped in there that they hope we don't notice. This week, I've been writing about the reports that actually the government is planning to tax employers' pension contributions. So it gets a bit techie, but essentially the big row about this is they're going to exempt public sector employers. So the NHS, schools, government departments won't have to pay this tax. Or I think actually they pay it and then they're reimbursed. Now, this again leans into the two-tier care thing. So Baroness Ros Altman, she's written a piece for the Express today where she talks about that actually there's a big gap already between private sector pensions, public sector pensions. And if you go down this route, then it disincentivises private employers to be generous with their pensions, and that will make the system even worse. And I think there's a real lack of private sector experience around the cabinet table. There's nobody there who has set up a business and taken it to success. So I think you can kind of see this this is always the worry with Labour, isn't it? If you're from the kind of right of politics, that Labour instinctively does not have any kind of private sector experience and so always favours trade unions and the state and doesn't really think about the impact on the private sector. And I think that could be a problem. Yeah,
I think that's an absolutely real danger. I think because we saw the issues in the first weeks of the government when the junior doctors' substitutes are settled sensibly, in my view, the train drivers got a good deal, and then what the Tories would have done anyway, which is agreed the broader public sector pay rise, which came from the pay review bodies, was done. But what you've got is, just in terms of the messaging and the sequencing, you've got all this happening early on, which needs to favour the public public sector. You've got people who by their nature are retired. Many of them will have been in the public sector, but many won't, in terms of the withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance. So what you can't have is a government that seems to just favour public sector workers, because there are huge numbers of Labour voters who don't work in the public sector. And anyway, in terms of the good of the country, you need to get the balance right. So this is a very odd situation. They need to, I mean, what actually happens is naturally, obviously, if the government taxes the people who work in the NHS, the cost of the NHS employing people gets higher, then the government will refund the NHS, because otherwise have to find some money to refund the NHS, because otherwise it's going to hit frontline services. But you need to message it by not giving the message that public sector people are exempt. So it's like you can't have two-tier taxation as part of the two-tier care thing. Yes, of course, you can make sure the NHS isn't out of pocket. That's a different way of describing it to saying public sector workers are exempt from paying it, which actually effectively they're not. It's basically the public, they're just refunding them. So they need to be really, really careful. And I think some of the messaging hasn't been as clear as it should have been, because everybody needs to share the burden. And I think the danger for this is that we've gone sort of from, when you sort of, you go to a cinema and now you see if you've got an NHS card you get 10% off or whatever, or free popcorn, or that sort of moment post-pandemic when anybody who worked in the NHS doing anything, whether they were shunting paper or saving lives on the front line, was a hero. I think what we don't want is public sector workers being demonised by those who work very hard in the private sector. And if you work in Asda or Aldi, you're working just as hard as somebody who works in a hospital, and you're probably just as likely to vote Labour, and you're likely to be paid less, and you also like to have a less good pension. So we need to remember that just because the Labour Party is based in the trade unions is obviously overwhelmingly public sector now, we need to not forget about all those millions of private sector workers, many of whom don't earn huge wages.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Mikey, what are you expecting from the budget?
So the interesting thing, as we're speaking this morning, on Thursday morning as we're recording this, is Rachel Reeves is on her way to Washington to speak at the International Monetary Fund. She's giving a speech, and as you were saying, most of the budget seems to have been briefed in advance. Briefing in advance is one thing. Saying it in a speech in public is quite another thing. So she is going to sort of coyly indicate that she's going to rewrite some of the government's fiscal rules, which is a really, really boring phrase that no one understands. But specifically, what she's going to do is change the method by which public sector debt is calculated. So what that effectively means, one of the fiscal rules, the rules that she said she would stick to, is that debt has to be going down. And what they're likely to do is slightly technical, but they're likely to make it so if you end up with an asset, that asset is counted against the debt, so the debt goes down. The upshot of this is that she's got 50-60 billion quid left to play with. Now, that can't be used for day-to-day spending, so can't be used for like government departments to pay staff wages, for example.
Or to bring back the winter fuel allowance. What it can be used for is infrastructure. It can be used to build things, so schools, hospitals, roads, big projects, perhaps even a train line or two. You never know. But if we're looking for things that haven't been pre-briefed out of the budget yet, I think that's where it's going to be. It's going to be the big infrastructure projects that we don't know about yet. Yeah, because what effectively she's doing in Washington is laying out the hat from which she's going to pull out the rabbit, i.e. the mechanism by which she's going to be able to do big ticket investments. So I think that's what they're thinking is they'll just get away with without the speaker shouting at them, because they're emphasising the system, but the actual specifics will come in the budget. I mean, I'm hoping in terms of the briefing that some of the scare stories aren't true and they're out there, so she can go, I'm not going to. I mean, I think, for example, watch out for the £2 bus fare cap, which, I mean, a Labour government basically increasing bus fares. Buses tend to be used for younger students, younger people, and people with lower wages. The fact that the Labour government was going to take away a Tory £2 cap is the sort of thing that has been out there, and she may well say, I've saved them, having said you're the only person who ever said you're going to get rid of them. Such are the arts of politics. But I think you're absolutely right that it's this big project, big ticket items. And in terms of fiscal responsibility, Rachel would say the Tories gave us a list of hospitals they wanted to build, but they never wrote the check to pay for them. Well, actually, here's the check. So I think that's absolutely what we're going to get in the book there.
Yeah, and the reason she's doing it today, a week out from the budget, is because she doesn't want another situation like Liz Truss had, where she unveiled this mini budget which had loads of major changes in it, spending, no tax rises, or and it spooked the markets. And she's doing it to the IMF, who were going to be broadly in favour of this, and sort of hinting at it in advance, so everyone's like, okay, be cool. Everything's fine, when she actually announced it on Wednesday.
Absolutely.
It's going to be fascinating, and we've only got a few days to go before we actually find out the details for certain.
Wait.
So it's going to be exciting. Big row this week about Keir Starmer, the Labour Party, and their apparent interference in the American election. Donald Trump has gone to court about this. Tell us what you think about it, Mikey.
So this is a complaint that's been made to the Federal Election Commission, complaining that 100 or so Labour Party volunteers, activists, have gone over to help with Kamala Harris's campaign. This is not in any way unusual. This happens in every election. The Tories do it, Labour do it. They send people over to help out their sister parties. And this is all perfectly normal. The only difference is that Donald Trump has noticed and is looking for as many grievances as he can find to stack up in case he loses, so he's got things to point at to say the race was unfair. The other thing that is really, I have found fascinating the last couple of days, is the hypocrisy from some of the people in the UK complaining about this. So Nigel Farage has been up in arms. Nigel Farage, who repeatedly has travelled across the Atlantic to campaign with his friend Donald Trump. Most recently in August, when he went over to the Republican National Convention on a private jet, which was paid for by one of his party donors, and cost about £33,000. Now, the American election rules say if you spend more than a grand getting there, then it counts as a donation, and that's illegal. So slightly unclear whether Nigel has broken any of the rules he's complaining about himself. And people are saying, "Oh, yeah, but Nigel Farage, he's not in the party of government. He, some of the times he went over, he wasn't even an MP." All right, fair enough. Liz Truss also went to the RNC when she was not only an MP but a member of the party of government, and I think she spent about $1,500 getting there. So
maybe she's going up in jail.
It's a bit of a circular firing squad. This
Can you actually get there any cheaper than that? I mean, there's no kind of like megabus to America, is there? I don't know.
800 quid.
Yes, absolutely. I can assure you that all the Labour people went in economy. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a kind of farcical element to this, which is effectively trying to create a row where there isn't one. Because as we've seen, we saw Robert Buckland, who's not only a Tory but was also the Attorney General, if I'm not mistaken. So the government's chief lawyer, a man of great rectitude and respect, who said, I went to campaign for the Democrats as well. And also, what really annoys me is one of the jobs that I did after I stopped working for Ed is I ran a political network of sort of progressive leaders around the world. And we used to regularly bring people together. Now, not always at election time, but, we wanted to learn from election successes. So shortly after the Canadian election, we got people together. Jonathan Ashworth is now in Parliament, had already gone over to Canada and written a report about it. And we should learn from other countries. We shouldn't be isolated Britain. I mean, one of the problems in politics is people come here. On election night, I had two people from Europe who were desperate to go to Labour's election party, and I'm trying to get them in, and I can't, and people are going, oh no, I don't want any, because you've only got so many tickets. And there's always an issue about people being enthusiastic. I mean, the idea that 100 Labour are geeks, and that's what they are, grabbing as much merch as they can to take home because their mates have all texted them saying, I want this, I want that. I mean, when you walk into a Labour house, there's normally the Hillary Clinton love not hate poster framed. I can visualise one in a former Labour MP's house as we speak. The idea that they're going to swing the election against the Donald is daft. I mean, it's a little bit like, during the referendum campaign, it's obviously we're all in the same country, but the problem in Scotland was our Scottish colleagues, we had all these English Labour Party members wanted to go up, and at that particular moment it perhaps perhaps wasn't
Didn't
politique.
help.
No.
Absolutely. So we, so on the night of the referendum, all of those of us in Ed's office, including actually some Scottish, we were all sent to the most unionist area where they were flying DUP flags and Rangers flags somewhere in Govan, I think, because that was thought safest. So I mean, it's like, how do you deploy all these kind of English-speaking? I mean, at least in America, people go, "Oh, gee, you've got a lovely accent,"
Yeah.
which they weren't saying to us on referendum night in Glasgow. I love Glasgow, though I do, and love Daily Record readers as much as I do.
I think maybe you deploy the Brits with plummy accent in the get out the vote portion of the campaign, rather than trying to convince
Absolutely.
Trump voters to vote for
Totally.
for Harris.
I think, I mean, I struggle to get too exercised about this row. I think it was probably handled a bit badly. You don't put it on LinkedIn. Don't do a big advert. You know,
My
don't-
views
don't
never
make it
use
a thing.
LinkedIn for anything.
Well, yeah, I mean, who
Can't
uses
agree.
LinkedIn? Why would you do that? But anyway,
Some it's a new dating. People are picking up dates on
No.
LinkedIn. But
Oh,
anyway, that's a
really?
whole other discussion.
Oh, that sounds
Oh, no.
very. Oh no,
Yes.
let's not go down that route. But I think yeah, it's probably handled a bit badly. Donald Trump, we all know, is very. Yeah,
He'll seize
he holds a
anything.
grudge, so you have to be a little bit careful with these things. But I think on the whole, all parties kind of
Absolutely.
cross the Atlantic and try and build ties with their sister parties. I can't get too.
I mean,
excited
talking about
it.
going to Samoa, the best gig was going to was anybody who wants to go to Australia and New Zealand to learn from elections, because obviously our close siblings. That one was quite popular when I was the purveyor of mini breaks to the Labour Party, as somebody once said very briefly.
If you've got any confessions here, Matthew, about.
And I always made sure that everybody declared their trips.
That's
right.
what we like to hear. But I think the American election has been quite fascinating, because obviously we're getting into the closing days of the campaign now, and it's obviously all getting a bit nasty. Donald Trump is accusing Labour of being, far left. Keir Starmer, far left. Who knew? And obviously trying to deploy that as a tactic out there. But obviously Kamala Harris today has called Donald Trump a fascist. That's causing a bit of a upset out there. Is he a fascist? People have been getting out the dictionary definition to work out, whether he meets that criteria. But you can see there is a sudden kind of desperation in the campaign on both sides in this dying day. Who are you thinking is going to win, Matthew?
So I think Harris will just squeak it,
Okay.
but I think it's going to be pretty darned close, to use an
Yeah.
Americanism. And we've got this weird situation where some of the two states divide their votes that the state delivers between congressional districts, and I think it might come down, to the individual one. If it's one vote from one congressional district in Omaha, in Nebraska. So I mean, suddenly you're sort of seeing people who wouldn't normally go to Nebraska to campaign because it's normally a safe Republican, but they may get one electoral college vote from this little corner of it. I mean, I personally think that the F word should be avoided, both the F word and the fascist word. I think he's a demagogue. I mean, I think he's genuinely frightening. And we've seen with people, I mean, the idea that the Cheneys, not just Liz, but her dad too, who are absolute, do you remember when the last British interference elections and all those Guardian readers were writing to Americans begging them not to re-elect Bush Cheney, and now Cheney is on the side of the Guardian.
Yeah.
I mean, that shows you. That was a disaster.
Quite a
Even more of a disaster than
Didn't go
100
down
Labour
well.
staff are stuffing up. You can stuff envelopes. Don't speak to anybody. I think he's a demagogue. I think he's frightening. I'm very worried what will happen if he's re-elected. But I would just. I think the worst thing talking about those Hillary Clinton posters was when Hillary Clinton appeared to demonise people who voted for Trump. That's the worst ever tactic. And actually, what she's been great at is the hope and the momentum and getting turnout out. So let's hope it's a one-off. I wouldn't use the F word again before Election Day.
I would use the F word. I think if you don't want people to call you a fascist, you should probably stop saying fascist things.
Yeah, I sometimes even if they are a bit of a fascist, maybe it's better not to say it, but I know what you mean. It's so tempting because it's quite scary.
He's threatened to send the army after his political opponents. That's what fascists
Let's
do.
hope the Labour staffers get back quick enough. If I were them, I'd be very...
On the first plane back.
They could be arrested on
So, Sam, what was your moment of the week?
Well, it's been a big week this week. We've had the verdict in the trial of Martin Blake, the police, the firearms officer who was accused of the murder of Chris Cabba. He was obviously cleared. He was cleared with it under 3 hours. He now faces a life of danger. There is a price on his head. As a result, Yvette Cooper has announced this week that firearms officers who should they ever have to endure this, they will remain anonymous to the point of conviction. And I think that is a really, really important move.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's going to be total cross-party agreement on that, isn't there?
Yeah, I think so.
There is. I think you need to be a bit careful about it because, I mean, there's not a lot of people get absolute anonymity in court cases for good reason, because the more anonymity you give, the less you can scrutinise how the courts work and various things. But I think you're right. In this situation, people are putting their lives on the line. They're putting particularly their families' lives at risk potentially by taking these jobs, and it's really hard to recruit for them.
They're putting their lives on the line for us,
Yeah.
and I think that it's a sensible move, and good on Yvette Cooper for doing that. Matthew, you're a special guest. Tell us yours.
Yeah, so my moment of the week was political journalist John Stapleton, who is one of those people who everybody loves. He was he's a veteran. He won't mind me saying so. And he was there. We've had the anniversary of the Brighton bombing in the last couple of weeks, and he worked for TVAM, and he was there on the phone at the Brighton bomb because they didn't have a camera crew. So he tells some funny stories about how they had a picture of the Grand Hotel looking from 1954, looking like a wedding cake, while the BBC had sort of 17 trucks, and what was then TVAM, he just had him on the phone. So, I mean, John is an absolute, legend of political journalism, and he's announced this week that he's suffering with Parkinson's disease, and I think it's been a really brave move to do that. It's been hugely welcomed by the Parkinson's disease community as coming out and discussing it, and it's really opened up a topic. So good on John for that, and I think that will get politicians, as well as the public, thinking more about what we need to do about Parkinson's.
He's a great man, and he's been a reassuring voice.
And a legendary luncher as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely.
I've never had the pleasure.
Oh, no, yeah, Langhams.
Always pro a legendary luncher.
And a big Man City fan.
Mikey, what about you?
My moment of the week, I think, has to be the final, probably, battle of the gingers. So this is when the Prime Minister's away, the deputies do PMQs, and for a while it has been obviously Angela Rayner and Oliver Dowden, and we all roll our eyes slightly when these things happen because it's not going to make any news. They're not, but they have an interesting rapport.
It is interesting.
It is really interesting.
I couldn't really explain it.
They were
It's
almost on Wednesday. If you watched it, they were almost flirting.
It was strangely flirtatious.
And there was a moment where Angela Rayner was sitting down in the Prime Minister's seat next to the dispatch box doing little heart symbols across the dispatch box.
Only Anne's get away with it.
Exactly.
Do you think it's a podcast in the making for when it's all
potentially.
over? For when it's all over?
Yeah.
Maybe it's a vision of the future. Maybe it's a vision of future leaders of both parties and what politics might be like in the future. You never
Who
know.
needs Ed Balls and George Osborne when you've
Absolutely.
got Angie and Ollie?
If people aren't trying to sign that contract right now.
They should be.
They should be.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much
Absolute
for joining us.
pleasure.
It's been a real joy to have you
so
here.
much.
And but that's been it for this week. We'll join you again next week. I'll be back with Lizzie. We'll be analysing the budget, and hopefully we'll have another special guest. So bye for now.